What happened that day? Do the setup for us.
Okay, so the setup is I was invited by an apostle down there who we work with, and he invited everybody within his whole apostolic organization had come together. They were fasting and they were praying for us. And so they have a place that they call Prayer Mountain, and they own this mountaintop, and it is a prayer garden. It is where they go to fast and where they go to pray. And so I went up there, and there's, I don't know, 20 or 30, maybe even more people up there waiting. They're fasting and praying. They sit me down in a chair. We're outside. And when these people start praying for you, it's not going to be a polite American prayer. It's going to be every one of them is going to pray for probably 20 minutes and lose their minds. And so you spend the day just sitting in a chair, and I don't hardly speak Spanish. And so they're praying for me. And after, the first couple hours, don't get me wrong, man, the power of God is moving, and it was a great privilege. But there's nothing to do because you don't speak the language, and you just get in the spirit and you see things, you hear things, and you just pray and you just do that. I'm sitting in this chair. Well, in Chiapas, the Chiapas mountains down there, Katie, are huge, and they're 18,000 feet tall. And so the mountains, the biggest mountains within the United States is 14,000 feet. So these things are 4,000 feet bigger than the Rocky Mountains. They're just so beautiful. It's such an incredibly beautiful place. Wow. And I'm sitting there and I'm looking over the ridge, and I'm thinking, I might have somebody bring me a notebook, and I might start drawing, because God will prophetically give me pictures and stuff, and I like to draw and I like to do stuff like that. And so I was looking at this bald ridge, which was the next ridge over from us, and there was this one big lone tree. And I thought, that's odd that there's only one big tree there. And I thought, okay, if I drew that, how would I draw it? And in my mind, I'm processing like, yeah, I think I will draw that. And maybe if I'll draw this and draw that. And so I'm really looking in detail. I looked around for a little while longer, and then I looked back, and that same bald ridge where there had been one tree, now there was two trees there. What? And I thought, there's no way that there's two trees there. Like, I know I looked at it for a long time, and there was only one tree there. And I'm like, what the heck? How did I not see the other tree? I'm like, that's crazy. Like, I know for a fact there was only one tree there. And as I was looking at it and as I was pondering it, this second tree, a big, giant tree on the top of this otherwise bald ridge, except for this one tree beside it, all of a sudden, it transformed, and two arms came out of the side of it, and two legs appeared, and it turned into a being. And it made a couple of moves, and then it turned back into a tree again.
Oh, my God.
And I'm just standing there, and I'm looking at it. I'm like, what in the wide, wide world of sports did I just see? And I'm sitting there going, what in the heck? And so I get to looking, and I'm eyeballing it, and I'm eyeballing it. And then all of a sudden, it does the same thing. And shoulders appear, arms come out, shoulders appear, two legs appear, and it kind of gets situated, and then it kind of leans forward a little bit. It stays in this humanoid form, and it leans in, and I can tell it's listening, and then it just gets real still, and it turns back into this tree. And I thought, that is a regional entity. That is a regional little g God. That is the giant that they've been talking about. This thing had a physicality about it. It wasn't a poof, Katie, even though it could transform and it could shapeshift. It wasn't a poof kind of demon. It had a true physicality about it. And whenever it would turn back into a tree, it would move exactly the way that the tree next to it moved. Exactly.
Oh, man.
And then when it would turn back into this humanoid type person, he would move, or he would get closer, or at one point he even switched sides. But the last time that I saw him do that, he leaned forward, and I could tell he was listening. And I thought, that demon from hell is listening to this prayer that is going on this mountain. And I'm sitting there looking at him going, oh my gosh. And so I thought, if it can hear this prayer, it can hear me. And so I leaned forward and I said, I see you, you devil.
Wow.
And I don't know what you got away with down here for so long, but you're not getting away with it anymore. I am here in the name of King Jesus, and we're going to rescue so many kids, and there's nothing you can do about it. And when I said that, it changed into a very scary form. And he didn't care who saw him after that, because I told him I saw him. And he started swaying back and forth. He started rocking back and forth like, I'm going to beat your eyes shut, and he started making all these gestures and rocking back and forth and like blowing up and like, okay, well, I see you is what he said. And I was sitting there and I was just like, nope, in the name of Jesus, you're defeated. There's a new sheriff in town. We have authority here. We were invited by the indigenous people here, the people that love King Jesus. We're not stepping into some other territory. We're stepping into kingdom territory, and we're bringing the kingdom with us. We are going to rescue children here. Your days of getting away with this is done, and there's nothing you can do about it. Light maketh manifest. You're going to be known everywhere we're at, and it's also going to be known that you are defeated in the name of King Jesus. And I was talking, and it was just doing its head like this, and it was getting so mad. And I was sitting there, and I was just watching this thing, and I'm talking to it. Well, as I'm getting fervent in my declarations against this demonic manifestation, the people that are praying for me who do not speak English, they're just getting really hyped up because they're praying, and I'm yelling this thing. And my son Ben was, I don't know, he's 30 yards away from me, and he just heard me getting a little bit loud, and he was listening to me, and he goes, "Who are you talking to, Dad?" And I said, "Come here." And he comes over to me, and I said, "Ben, turn around and tell me what you see up there on top of that ridge." And Ben turned around and he looked up there, Katie, and he said, "It's a freaking giant."
Oh.
And I said, "Yes, sir.
Wow.
It sure is." And Ben said, "Wow." And I said, "Pray with me against this thing." And so Ben put his hand on my shoulder, and we just started going, "We rebuke you in the name of Jesus. We have generations of generational promise here. The Spirit of the Lord is here. God Almighty is rescuing children here." And my son started prophesying against it. So Jerry Sellers, who is my executive pastor, he's off wandering around praying somewhere. And I yelled at him. I said, "Jerry, come here." And so Jerry comes over here. He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Now look, now don't panic and don't freak out, but turn around and tell me what you see on that mountain up there." And he turned around, he's like, "Where?" And I said, "Up on the top up there." And he goes, "Oh my God, it's a giant." And when he said that, this thing kind of went like this, and it turned around, and as it took like 3 strides, and it was over the face. And as it did, it changed back and forth from a tree to a person, to a tree to a person as it was going off. And thing can camouflage somehow. And we're like, wow. So then the people, they're looking at what we're looking at, and they don't see it now because it's gone. And they're like, "What's going on? Que pasa?" And I said, "Guys, does anybody here ever tell y'all that there's a giant in this region?" And all the pastors went, "Yeah, there's one that lives on top of that mountain right up there."
Oh my gosh. Wow, you've got like 5 or 6 or more people confirming.
Yeah. And I was like, "Okay, well, we just saw it." He said, "Yeah, he's a devil." And they just went, "Yeah, to hell with that devil." And they just went right back to praying. I mean, it's just part of their life.
Metaskizmazotoi, that's the word here. Okay, the word in Greek here is about metaskizmazotoi. It says, "Marvel not," I think it's 2 Corinthians 4:4. "Marvel not, for your adversary, the devil, masquerades, transforms himself as an angel of light, and his ministers, his apostles, do likewise." That is what you're dealing with. Metaskizmazotoi is the Greek word for that. It is literally a shapeshifter. That is what you would call it, like skinwalkers. I got into a lot of the Dene people stuff, and I was trying to learn how to fight back against these people. So I got initiated into the stuff with the Apache and the Navajo on this reservation out there outside of Show Low, Lakeside, and Pine Top, Arizona. My family moved right next to the reservation out there, and they started doing a lot of these occult workings with this different cult that had a lot of Mormonism and a lot of other it was strange doctrines. I'll just tell you that much. It was different than the stuff that's going on in Lake Havasu and in Phoenix. But these people, when I was in there, they started initiating me into be what's part of what you would call a skinwalker, shamanism, and trying to learn as part of a trade of becoming an assassin. I wanted to learn how to be silent. I wanted to be able to be undetectable. And they were the people that you're supposed to go to, that you could learn how to walk without leaving footprints, that you could learn how to walk on leaves and dry brush without making any sounds. I wanted to learn how to walk between realms is what it was called. And so the way that you do that, the way that skinwalkers and these people that start to mix themselves and be able to shapeshift themselves into other creatures and other beings and stuff like that, was you had to kill one of your own bloodline family relatives. You generally had to strangle them to death, either with a garrote, which is a strangulation wire, or you had to use your bare hands. And you weren't allowed to it almost always required that you did not spill their blood. It was all about suffocation, and it was all about breathing in their nefesh, their life as their life was passing forward. So you go through this stuff to kill somebody who you loved. I didn't have bloodline family members in the same way, and so another person was brought in as a substitute, and this is filthy stuff I had to talk about. And
overcoming giants is a huge biblical theme.
And it returns in the end times. It returns in, for instance, we are talking about Joel's army. That is not an earthly army because it uses again the terminology mighty men. And see, you know, people try and spiritualize that we'll rise up. That's not what it's talking about.
Yeah.
It's not talking about us. People don't understand that the end times and giants are inseparable.
In the course of this enterprise, Steve was contacted by this elderly woman who told him that her son, he needs to talk to her son because her son has a very important story to tell. And she had been listening to Steve for a long time, and she was encouraging her son to talk to Steve, and so she connected them. It turns out that her son was an active duty C-130 pilot who had allegedly picked up the body of a dead giant out of Bagram Airfield in his C-130, the government C-130 that he flew. And so we decided to fly him into Bozeman and to interview him for our film in the series. And he told us that in 2005, he flew a mission into Bagram Airfield. Now, this was not uncommon. He was flying routinely into Bagram Airfield to pick up what he described as high-value assets, which were usually like high-level Taliban guys. And so many of the missions he flew were classified. He thought this was a routine mission. In 2005, on this particular occasion, he lands on the tarmac, and he realized this was not a routine mission because he was met on the tarmac by who he describes, who he believes were Air Force intelligence or Army intelligence. He didn't know, but he referred to them as the babysitters. And he gets off the plane with his loadmaster, and these intelligence officers told him, highly classified, this never happened. And they escort him, which he had never been met on the tarmac by anyone before like that. They escort him over to the hangar where the cargo that he's got to load is sitting. And as he's getting close to this cargo, the first thing he's struck with is this pungent odor. He said it was very, very strong. It was this musky odor. It was a combination of BO and death. And it was very powerful. And he realized there's something dead under a tarp on this crate, on this pallet. And as he's getting up close to this thing, he realizes that it's a person. And this is a air cargo pallet. So it's 9 feet long.
Yeah.
And the guy that's on this pallet, he's covered by a tarp. He's in the fetal position, but his hands and his feet and his head are hanging off the pallet. This is a 9-foot-long pallet. So he immediately recognizes that this is a gigantic person. He's got to be 10 to 12 feet tall, more like 12 feet tall. And he walks up to the cargo, and there's a group of, he thinks they were Marines standing around, kind of guarding it, and the babysitters, the intelligence guys. And he said that this giant was, again, so large that he was in the fetal position, but part of his body's hanging out. Most of his body's covered by a tarp, but you could see the head. So he saw the hair, which was red. The hair was red. He saw the hands and the feet, which had 6 fingers and 6 toes. And the feet were wrapped in a crude, like canvas, primitive footwear. And the skin of the giant was white, almost like pale white. But he thinks that might be because it was dead, had been dead for a couple of days. And he said he would pound this thing with his fist, under the tarp. And he said it was a brick. It was solid. You could tell it was just muscular. He said, now, rigor mortis, it was dead, but he said you could just tell, just even by the parts of the body that were sticking out under the tarp, this dude was jacked. And the guys standing around the body told him that they had heard that a team of guys, probably special forces at this point, 2005, I don't think we had yet committed a lot of troops to Afghanistan at this point. Maybe I'm wrong. I can't remember. I think this was early on. Could be wrong about that. But he said there was a team of guys that went on a reconnaissance mission. This is what the soldiers told him, guarding the body. And they were out in Afghanistan, the Kandahar region, and they came upon a cave. And there was a village in proximity to the cave, and the villagers were depositing various items at the mouth of this cave, food items and other things. And so they assumed that these villagers were aiding and abetting the Taliban who were hiding in the cave. And so they went into the cave, this team of guys. And instead of finding the Taliban, they were confronted with this very large, hostile giant who killed them all. And so another team was dispatched to go and find this missing team, and they followed the tracks and went to where the last transmissions were from this team. And he said that the story goes that when they went into the cave, the giant was eating on the guys that had slaughtered. And they were able to take him down. Now, there's another story told by my colleague, L.A. Marsuli, where he had a whistleblower come to him about this incident, which we're not sure if it's the same incident or a different incident, where the giant speared one of these guys from the second team. Might be a separate story, but not 100% sure. But they killed the giant, and then they airlifted him out by helicopter to Bagram Airfield. And this is where our pilot picks up the story, and he's there to load the body. And so they had to weigh the cargo to put it on the airplane. And the loadmaster weighed it at 1,500 pounds, subtracting the pallet, the air cargo pallet. They knew that the body weighed exactly 1,100 pounds, or approximately, I should say, 1,100 pounds. But they knew that was the weight because that was the weight that was being loaded onto the C-130. 1,100 pounds. So 12 foot tall, 1,100 pounds. And 6 fingers, 6 toes. After they loaded the cargo, he had to take it to Qatar and unload it in Qatar. And then he told me he heard through the grapevine that the giant, the dead giant, ultimately made its way to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Now, he didn't know for sure, but that's what he heard.
They've got entire populations that they have bred that are workers down there in their, in connection to different areas or places. And these elite have contracts. Why do we not see, think about this, even up through the 40s, you had theories, you had images, you had people trying to prove things like fairies, like giants, you had discoveries, archaeology, all these things that we're saying that they're there. There's these things that we know, whether they're giants, whether there's albinos, whether there's fairies, mermaids, unicorns. There was a discovery and a producing of evidence of, these beings and creatures. And yet, why did it all of a sudden just disappear in the 40s?
In your book, True Legends, you talk about a Smithsonian cover-up whenever giant bones are involved. So I want to ask you the question that everybody always asks. Where are all the giant bones?
It's interesting, Tim, because of the bias of the Smithsonian and their contempt for out-of-place artifacts. Every time giants were found, it didn't matter if it was on the West Coast, the Arctic, the Antarctic, believe it or not, the East Coast, the Ohio River mounds. They always have a fabulous cutoff point, meaning once the Smithsonian is notified and those bones are sent to the Smithsonian, they're never heard from again. And there's denials. A good example of that, it was a famous Kincaid expedition to the Grand Canyon where they found the Egyptian citadel. Even the Phoenix Gazette carried that story. So, Tim, the cover-up has always been to keep this biblically relevant topic out of the minds of the people, so at an appropriate time in the future, they can claim whatever they want to claim, and they'll claim anything and everything apart from the true biblical origin of giants.
So, Steve, even during World War II, there were reports of giants and cannibalism coming out of the Solomon Islands. What was that all about?
After World War II, people couldn't reconcile the fact that a lot of servicemen, U.S. servicemen, had been eaten, cannibalized, as well as Japanese. And the fascinating investigation I've come up with was the fact that the Solomon Islands are riddled with stories of cannibalistic giants and even living giants to this day. I was contacted by a man named Marius who was literally going to meet me in California with, let's just say this, irrefutable evidence. But he said to me on the phone, he said, Steve, I'm being followed and I'm not sure I'll even make it there alive. What has to be asked, the question that needs to be asked and has to be asked, is that why do people who have the evidence, why are they intimidated? Why are they threatened? Why are they disappeared? What is this cover-up? And I'll tell you the bottom line, they do not want people to understand that the sons of God, the fallen angels, saw that the daughters of earth were fair, mated with them, and produced a literally new race of hybrid beings that the Bible calls the Rephaim. And the Rephaim are with us today. They're genetic trace, they're genetic markers. And when we get into super soldiers, Tim, the super soldiers, the most important expenditures made are to identify not only the bloodline, but the genetic traits. There are people literally not only wanting to bring the giants back, but to insert giant genes in our soldiers to give them the super soldier ability. More money is being spent to identify genetic traces and markers, the actual gene prints of giants, both dead and extractable DNA from their teeth, from whatever cells in the mummies, to literally living giants today.
So in other words, what you're saying is somebody's trying to weaponize giant genes.
Absolutely.
I have encountered different people in government and military who I have always asking them about UFOs and crash retrievals and alien bodies. And these people are very candid with me. You know, they say things to you in a setting where you're sitting there smoking a cigar, drinking an old fashioned, that they wouldn't say in any other kind of setting, right?
Yeah.
And they'll tell you things freely. But as soon as you start to question about the Kandahar giant or the topic of giants in general, these guys freeze. Like, they'll talk about aliens, but if you want to talk about giants, that's a whole nother level of trouble, let's say. And I have a friend who I told this story to, and, you know, he thought, I don't know if I believe that. And I don't want to give any of the details away, but he went and was with a, let me be careful. Let me be ambiguous here. He was with a staffer of a senator who's a friend of his. And this staffer had spent time in the military, in pretty high level. And in the course of their conversation, he said to this guy, hey, do you know anything about, I was just with Timothy Alberino, and he told me about this Kandahar giant story. And like, you know anything about that? Just throwing it out there, right? And he and the staffer have a great relationship, and very jovial guy and casual. And he said as soon as he said that, the guy went dead serious on him and looked at him and said, hey, what are you getting yourself into? Please be careful.
Wow.
Be careful. This is, you know, in no uncertain terms, he told him, be careful with this topic. This is, you know, in no uncertain terms, he told him, be careful with this topic. This is dangerous. And he was shocked that he got that kind of reaction.
You know, there was a covering of what's really there, but it was more than that. They found a different way to do their contracts and to bind these other beings below the surface of the earth so that we, you know, we're not seeing them, so that we didn't have that in our reality. Why? So that they could control several end time scenarios. I think it's directly connected with that. What are some of those scenarios? You get the alien scenario, you get, you know, how easy is it for them if they hide a certain beings with certain features, and then all of a sudden, you know, bring it out years later when people have never seen or never witnessed that type of being. They're able to run with that to cause fear, to make us afraid, and to make us react in a negative way to destroy. And how many classes of aliens do they have? How does that connect to what really is underground and the mutations, the different formations that they produce? You know, you also get your end time scenario of the rise of the Titans.
All right, so we rescue kids in Chiapas, Mexico, and we have a ministry that rescues children all over the world out of sexual trafficking. I've been doing that for 30 years. And when you do that, you come across really blurry stuff. There's a lot of witchcraft involved in it, a lot of Nephilim sex magic. There is all kinds of blood ritualism, satanic ritualism, and there's just a lot of witchcraft and all kinds of stuff. And so it doesn't really shock me to see crazy things. And in the context of an American context, you're like, if you say, hey, I saw a giant or I saw this, people are like, whoa, wait, stop. For us, it's just like, yeah, you know, you see stuff. So we were down there and we were rescuing kids. And one of the things that all the kids say in that region is when many times there'll be many children disappear at one time and they'll say they fed them to the giant. And you just think that that's just a metaphor. That's something that they say to scare the kids. The cartel there is really, really bad. And the largest Mayan pyramid on the planet Earth is there. And it is the only privately owned Mayan pyramid on the planet Earth.
Wait, stop right there. What do you mean? Somebody actually owns a Mayan pyramid? That these people must be Satanists then. They're using the power of the pyramid to do rituals? What is this?
Yeah, no, I've been there, and I went there with Brian Schwartz and a bunch of our team, and yeah, it's privately owned, and people come. They have private meetings there from all over the world, and all kinds of madness happens there. Our rescue home, which is called it's called Redemption Ranch, and it's literally, you can see the pyramid from our place, on the very place where untold number of children have been slaughtered. In that very place, we're actually rescuing children there.
Wow,
and they have crazy things happen. The guy that runs the place told me that there are certain times of the year that the stars come down and turn into people and all kinds of things. And I'm like, oh, really? He said, yeah.
And a big component of that were these ancient records that they started discovering. It was his ancestor who was an archaeologist that began to dig into a lot of the mounds in the Ohio River Valley, specifically in Ohio and another area in central Michigan and lower Michigan, where they started finding these serpent mounds. And it's not that they were necessarily the people that found them, but he found a particular one that opened up into a chamber where they found these ancient texts, and they didn't necessarily know how to decipher them, but somebody was able to decipher them, and they figured out that it was this priest class, and it was a burial chamber that had a lot of their relics that were contained inside this. And in those books was these old religions, the ways of awakening the plumed serpent. The name America comes from the word for the land of the plumed serpent. This is what this land has been called for thousands of years, predating Vespucci and these Italian map makers who they say they gave this credit for the guy's first name. But it's not. People have been calling it that land for a long time because that is what was the mighty one, the deity that ruled and reigned over this territory for thousands of years. And that cult, the way that they got in contact, basically a lot of these rites and rituals, you guys, that they get kind of occulted, meaning they just get concealed or they made secret. What they're actually bringing forth during this, what is the man behind the curtain, is a way to dial the phone book to the Watchers, to these Gregories, these fallen ones who have been bound in chains of darkness, waiting until there's either a release or they are set free to go and wage their final campaign against the Most High and against the sons of Elohim. And so they had these books that gave them the ability to start doing these rites and rituals, to start making contact with them and started opening portals through child sacrifice predominantly is one of the main things. They demand blood. The details of what they found when they started coming over here. And one of the main overarching themes is the details of this specific Quetzalcoatl, which was the name of this deity, their mighty one at the time, this plumed serpent, and what their rites of passages were when they come into these temples and they were finding human beings carved to pieces. The priest class used to live inside these temples covered in dreadlocks that were made, their dreadlocks were this blood and human tissue organ systems that they would rub into their hair, and they never washed themselves. So they were like the Walking Dead, this kind of zombified class. And this was the priest class. And so the entire societal structure of Central America was based off of being able to bring in human material, like literal human material, as a means to feed this deity and this priest class system, which was cannibalistic. They carved up and had butchered stations where people were eating and selling each other wholesale, like a regular meat market was cannibalism.
Speaking of cerebral capabilities, the giants, even when they're in a stasis state, that means in suspended animation, whether it's Dr. Ernest Muldashev in Russia, in the mountains of Tibet, whether it's a whole underground base in which some of these entities, these living giants, are present, they have so much cerebral energy that they actually have what's called the red line, and you can't go past that. Or literally, they claim, according to special operations, 4-star generals, that literally it causes a person to almost come apart at the seams. It not only drives people mad, but it literally just causes them to go to pieces.
In a military weaponized sense, what other capabilities might these super soldiers have if they have the genes of giants?
Well, beyond the obvious of strength, beyond the obvious of almost supervision, super hearing, one of the most remarkable things from my 4-star general friend was basically said they hunt by DNA. Every person's DNA has a specific harmonic that they could identify a specific target's DNA and assign a Fido, the 19-foot giant, to go after. And it was interesting because when you think about it, even going back to Jack the Giant Killer and Jack Be Nimble, Jack Be Quick, as I've been researching all these, remember the statement? Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. You go to the Bible, and whose blood cried out? Righteous Abel blood cried out to the living God after Cain slew him. So the harmonics of blood is fascinating. That's why the cry of the innocent blood is such a big deal in God's eyes, and it truly is, because the blood has a signal, a frequency, and there have been studies to prove that. So they want the giants to be able to basically target specific DNA characteristics, not to mention the bottom line, and you know how much I love to say that, these entities want every last human being destroyed, and in its place, a hybrid. They're going to try and prove that God's a liar. Jesus himself said if the days weren't shortened, there'd be no flesh left alive, yet for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened.
You've turned down opportunities to work with some of the major networks on documentaries concerning giants. Why have you decided not to work with them? And furthermore, why have you decided to start your own production company, Gen 6 Productions?
Tim, it's just simply this. I believe the big lie that's going to be hoisted upon the world is that the aliens created mankind, which I categorically reject. It's funny, the people that will accept the fact that the Anunnaki, star creatures, came to this planet will avoid fallen angels like a plague. I wanted the correct, in my opinion, after 40 years of research, I wanted the correct historic and biblical presentation of the giants. And quite candidly, when I talk to some of them, if I start talking about fallen angels having sex with earth women, they snicker. Well, that snicker tells me they've already made up their mind. And I said, I will only appear on camera if I can have final edit of what I say.
Yeah, that was something, they do use. And, I witnessed them down by Emerald City is one of the biggest places. You get several Middle Eastern places where, they're going to be in connection with them. But that's part of the defense magic training, that they're going to have you encounter beings of different types. And, I think I've shared before how Michael Karkoc, who is the Legion of Defense leader for Hitler, in our training episodes, there were things that he would do that would absolutely scare the hell out of me. And that was one of his favorite things as he was, teaching the opening of the spiritual gates. He, if I could put it in words that would be understandable, you have those that are considered ghost warriors. They are able to walk through walls, go through floors. He was able to open a spiritual gate or portal on demand. So he would do things where, we could hear him, but we didn't know where he was coming from. And next thing, we'd be hearing him and he'd be doing the fee, fi, fo, fum. And next thing we know, we're being grabbed by the ankle and thrown through this, the air and put in a place that, it's like you'd have your breath knocked out of you, but you can't just, lay there on the ground until you get your breath. Like, he did it to teach us how to move and how to, survive. But it was so scary because you never knew what you were going to end up. And you were always terrified that it was going to be, a bad scenario. And there's stories out there, like we'll see things in the movies, which a lot of times they're portraying true things about, like, the giant sleeping, about song being something that, you get a connection in stories like Jack and the Beanstalk, of the harp being able to quiet the giants and make them sleep. You do get that component where they can be stilled or quieted. And, but at the same time, anything, usually it's smell, can wake them. And, then you're fighting something that you don't really have the ability as a person to fight. And that's the scary thing. And, that is part of their end time scenarios, the rise of the Titans, the release of these things back. I think that was a concern in Afghanistan when our former president, Sleepy Joe, decided to, leave all this equipment, military equipment, there in Afghanistan. And I honestly think that he found out the contracts had ended. And I think that they were leaving people as a sacrifice. And I think that that's why, you saw even the people were throwing children at the U.S. soldiers to take them. They were throwing their children and babies, saying, take them, take them. Why were they doing that? You had people hanging from planes in the air trying to get out of there. Why were they so terrified that they would rather, hang on a plane, risk it, and then fall from such heights to die? Like, what would cause people to be that drastic? I think it was things like that they feared they were going to be consumed alive. They feared what was coming up out of the ground once those contracts were null and void, and there wasn't anybody protecting them anymore. I think they were absolutely terrified.
Have you ever heard of any connection that, dude, like, can copper kill giants? Like, I always heard Steve Quayle, like, talking about they encapsulated the bullet of the Kandahar giant, and but I looked into trying to make a fully copper solid sword, but it would be too.
You want to talk about that for a second? This is something I've been making. This is okay. So I'm totally right there with you, Zach. I've been trying to figure out how can we. I just love that you say this. All right, let me show you all the copper that's hanging out around me for this reason. Okay, So this is a 10-ounce nugget or 10-ounce little cube of copper as well. Down in the underworld, back when I was going through like these ridiculous rituals, whatever you want to call it, man. When they would when they pour out a drink offering of blood, they were summoning up these creatures, these serpents, all right? And they were obsessed with the consumption of the blood, and blood has a lot of copper in there, right? You got a lot of iron, Well, in certain blood, like we are very deficient in copper. Copper is like one of these things that we have to have in our body in order for us to be able to absorb minerals. You need magnesium and copper, like the two most preeminent things. Well, most people are incredibly deficient of it, but people that are super high and regulated in it, their blood affected these beings. When these people were consuming this blood, and then these other like creatures that were very serpentine-like, they would reject certain blood. They would reject it. They would like cast it out and say the offering is impure and all this other stuff. But I have always wondered and speculated, was that toxic to them because they had a higher copper content in their blood? And if that was one of those reasons that like they rejected them. The other speculation that I think is more scripturally based is why they use bronze weaponry. They used bronze weaponry far even into the Iron Age. If you start to go and examine like bronze, for those of you that don't know, is a mixture of a metal alloy of copper and tin. When David fought Goliath, y'all, he had said that he had nothing but a staff in his hand, okay? He killed Goliath he didn't kill him with the stone. He killed him with his own sword. And there was this principle that's required in dealing with these other beings, that you dismember them. You cut their heads off. You keep their heads separate from their bodies, because this word Rephaim, which is like a class of these beings, these mixtures between angels and man, that are called Rephaim and Nephilim, okay? And the Rephaim are like kind of that first generation, like the purer bloods of it. And then as they kind of like, there's this like degradation of the bloodline purity as they went on, because there was less angel DNA and more human DNA. And over time, some of the healing benefits that came with that, their ability to like regenerate their bodies. This is kind of, when you start to dig open the word Rephaim and Rapha, there's this aspect of like the ability to heal themselves that's contained in there. And so this is why you'll see in these myths and these legends all about separating with vampires and werewolves and a lot of these things, that you separate their bodies, you tear their bodies apart, and you burn them for a reason, because they can heal themselves. And so this is why people used to drive stakes through the heads of vampires or people that were suspected of being Grigori. They would do this for a reason, because they have this ability to kind of come back from the dead. So one of the benefits that you'll find in like a lot of the legends about how people fought giants here, because this was the land of giants here in the Americas, and the way that they used it was copper tools. The copper trade in the Americas was preeminent as some of the greatest things that they had access to. The copper mines in Michigan in particular. Arizona has another the largest deposits of copper in all of the entire world, basically, are outside of Tucson, Arizona. It's unbelievable how much copper is there. But the purest forms of copper come right up there in northern Michigan, and they mine that stuff, and they find that exact variety of copper all over the Americas. I'm talking Central America, South America, coming from there. So there's this huge trade network for copper tools, and those copper arrows and stuff like that are the main predominant tool that was being used in hunting down the giants. A lot of them were red-haired giants that were being fought by the Indians because they were cannibalistic cult. That was like their big issue, y'all. Is they like to eat people. They're like, consumption of blood is their essential lust that these beings have, and you got to deal with that. So, dude, I am on a quest to try to make my own copper tools, and we got to go experiment with it. Bronze is a way better version because it's harder and it's tougher. The edge lasts longer. It doesn't bend as much. Like this stuff, I can bend with my fingers, and so you have to harden it, and that's where tin is really good for hardening it up. And but I'm all about trying to do that kind of stuff, man. That's why I love blades. Yeah. And I think that is a major component of so much of the origins of a lot of the major martial arts systems that are out there today. However, I believe there is, without question, a form of combatives that is not founded in that, because they like going back to that time in the wilderness, they had to have been preparing those men to be able to be soldiers, to have a combative forms of fighting, a physical way of fighting. When they came out of Egypt, y'all, in their first attack that they get attacked by the Amalekites, by Amalek, y'all, they get their butts torn up. You know what I'm saying? Like, and they were not soldiers. You got to understand, they were not accustomed to fighting. They had been under the influence of the greatest military oppression that had ever been. They had been trained to be slaves. And so just like later on, when they that fight that goes down, Joshua is out there leading the army, leading the people trying to fight back. And it's literally because of divine intervention that they're able to cast off and win in that battle. But every one of the people that had been more experienced soldiers, by the time they rot and die in the wilderness, so you're left with only Joshua and Caleb, and every man who is below the age of 20 years old becomes the new fighting force. They had to have been trained in a way of fighting that was specifically inclined, and I believe there was a pure form of combatives that goes all the way back to the days of Lamech, that goes all the way back to when these Nephilim and these hybrids were coming down and starting these battles. There was a form of priest class and occult knowledge that came with Enoch the evil. This is Enoch on Cain's side, which is totally where a lot of the mystery religions have their true origins from. Like the Freemasons like to borrow the lineage and say that, they go back to the sons of Seth. But the Enoch that they're claiming lineage and heraldry to is this Enoch of Cain, and that has a much more popular and I believe much more publicized version of martial arts systems that we have today. And those, however, there's definitely methods and practices within there that are pure martial arts that are just forms of combatives that are incredibly effective. Whereas like when I went into the military, the United States Army, they had a form of mixed martial arts. It wasn't just one specific style and combatives that was used. Finding a way to choke somebody out doesn't require you to go into a dojo. It doesn't require you to bow to a master. It doesn't require that. There's a way of cutting someone's Achilles to bring them down to the ground that is universal. There was a way that they had to attack these giants with tactics and with an effective means of bringing them down into an arena that they could kill them from. And so there's clearly the favor of Yah upon them to be able to do that. Otherwise, he wasn't sending his warriors and his mighty angels to be able to do that. And I believe at any given time, there could have been angels from Yah that came down and imparted, this is how you can effectively kill them. If it was metallurgy specifically, if it's like, hey, these are the types of tools specifically to use in order to do that. Like I got really big when I used to do a lot of firearms training, y'all, and I got into frangible munitions, because frangible munitions, they dump and expel all of their energies. The United States Marshals use these air marshals. If you've ever been on an airplane, you got to start shooting people in an airplane. You need a specific type of round to be able to do that, to dissipate its energy without puncturing through the outer hull of it and depressurizing the aircraft and causing other problems. So there's a type of munitions that's used, it's called frangibles. And so like I always carried frangible munitions with like an RP core, this thing called Liberty ammunition, which was designed to penetrate body armor and then cause massive cavitation and stuff like that. So there's frangibles, and then there's literally like, that basically makes your bullet like a tiny grenade. And so I was really about pure copper ones like that, and then starting to make mixtures with silver, coating them with silver. And I started making my own ammunition for that reason, because I was like, we got to be able to fight these guys. You know what I'm saying? We're going to be able to fight these giants and these dragons. Ultimately, at the end of the day, y'all, I'm all about tungsten armor piercing. I'm just going to be super transparent. That's why this is back here. There's all this like sneaky stuff on my wall back here. It's another massive passion of mine. Like this 30 millimeter round. Look at this sweet mother. I love this thing, dude. Okay, I'm just going to go there for you guys real quick, because this is a side nobody really asked me a lot about, but I'll totally talk combatives and stuff like that, because I also am preparing to fight a giant dragon army. I'll just be super straight with y'all. And I'm like, we got to find a way to prepare for that. Like I made a spear last night. That's what I did. I had a show that got canceled, and I was like, what am I going to do? I got 2 hours. I'm going to make a spear. So I made this spear.
Beautiful.
These giants aren't going to just let anybody come in there and make a contract with them. They're going to do what they want to do, and you will see a rise of that. But it doesn't, at the same time, it doesn't mean that we have to be afraid. We do have authority, and we have that authority in Jesus Christ. We do have the power to overcome. The scripture says they overcame the evil one by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. So we are able to overcome. And are we even able to do that with things that we would not consider necessarily weapons? Do we have weapons of warfare that are not of this world? Things like song and praise. We do.